and thanks very much for being here. You're all very welcome to this lecture, this Jean Monnet lecture, and I'm really delighted that we have Hanna with us today, who is an MLA in the Northern Ireland Assembly and former SDLP Brexit spokesperson. We had lunch and Claire was telling me that 2 years of her life were spent focused explicitly on Brexit, so she's nearly enjoying a bit of a break of late. But Claire was elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2015 and served as the Brexit spokesperson for a period during that time. And she also served as a Belfast City Councillor before that. Claire lives in Belfast. We were talking over lunch as well about how transformed Belfast is, and I'm sure you'll touch on that in your lecture. Sure. But Claire's going to talk about relationships after Brexit today. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, and thanks for being here. I do want to mention this event is sponsored by the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet programme. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Lovely to be here. I was explaining to Mary, I did my degree and master's part-time, so I was never your audience for an afternoon lecture, and I'm not that equipped in the long form, so I might bounce around for a few things. I was also saying it's hard to know whether we're very lucky or unlucky to be in politics at such a turbulent time, but the Chinese curse has never felt so real, and I'd like to live in boring times for a while. I haven't tried to give you an up to the minute on Brexit. Twitter will probably be your best source of news for where it's all going, but I did want to look at some of the impact it's having in politics in Northern Ireland. I'm instinctively optimistic, albeit in the middle of this journey of self-destruction in Brexit and being a member of an assembly that hasn't sat for 2 years. It's difficult to be optimistic, but I'm convinced. You feel like pushing the ball up the hill only for it to roll back down again in Northern Irish politics at the moment. But I think we have to be optimistic to overcome the polarisation, and I think that the populism and the deliberate dragging of every issue to the extremes, I think optimism is the only tool we have to stop people feeling disenfranchised with our political system, and who can blame them for feeling that way? Brexit obviously came after the years following the global financial crisis, the rise of technology and the loss of those breadwinner jobs, climate crisis, the feeling that future generations weren't going to prosper like the last, and those all weren't wounds created by Brexit, but they were exploited by Brexit's champions and exposed in a very serious way. And I think trust in politicians to solve some of those challenges have been eroded in Brexit as well. But particularly those fissures exposed in Britain and Northern Ireland in particular, we have to be very clear about what they are, or we're going to be unable to solve the problems. To me, it's not just a political crisis, it is a complete breakdown of respect for difference and trust and relationships in Northern Ireland, where we've, over the course of the last 3 years, lost our ability to constructively disagree with each other, and if you look at the debate across the water, nobody's just slightly wrong. They're a traitor. They're betraying your position, and we've lost that concept of persuading one another. We've thoroughly divided into our two tribes. It's difficult to have much faith and be somebody who knocks doors and tries to sell the concept of representative democracy, but we know we're not coming down with other options. I think particularly in the north, Brexit put more distance between people, and that was literally the last thing we needed. And I don't mean to be overly negative about it, but I can say that division in Northern Ireland is more alive than certainly any time it's been in my adult political life. And I turned 18 just shortly after the Good Friday Agreement, and certainly that sense of possibility and hope has been quite thoroughly wrung out of politics in the years since. And there's been a collective, I think certainly since Brexit, a collapse of community confidence in unionism, and I think a collective failure to sell and to manage the outcoming of Brexit, and to sell things like the backstop that had the potential to protect us. And then on the other hand, from nationalism and republicanism, and I think across the board in nationalism and republicanism, there's this narrative of the inevitability of Irish unity, or a particular brand of Irish unity at any cost that is inserting instability. I owe a lot of my politics to John Hume, who I hope will be familiar to you, civil rights leader and credit union activist and SDLP founder, and the thinker who recast Irish nationalism after many centuries. And his whole ethos was predicated on the idea that it was relationships that would bring about Ireland. It wasn't borders or flags, but building relationships of mutual respect and trust, and that by using the values of social democracy and that common ground to solve the challenges that affect everybody, whatever your constitutional preference, we would build that trust. And even those who quite vociferously opposed Hume during his time in active politics now all think within his stranded structures, and in many cases use a lot of his languages. But I don't think he could have envisaged how the Good Friday Agreement would be operated in the current day, and how every single issue is boiled down to an existential threat to your identity, and the wound is scratched probably in every day. So while everybody is talking Hume, as someone said, it's a bit like Christianity, it's never actually been tried in practice. The Belfast poet John Hewitt called on all of us Northerners to make amends by fraternising by small friendly gestures, hoping by patient words I may convince my people and this people that we're changed, if not to kin, to cohabitants, as ox and goat may graze in the same field again and gain something each from proximity. And that's the work that reconciliation sought. That it's challenging, it's tediously, but whatever happens in your constitutional terms, the goat and the ox will be grazing in the same field. And I think that's an immutable fact, and I think you can have a lot more vision for Northern Ireland and for Ireland, but whatever way we arrange it, the goat and the ox will be in the same field. At the same time, 1998 did agree a framework that would allow us as individuals and as political actors to outline and respectfully advance the case for our own constitutional position. I don't pretend that I have all of the answers to the problems we face, but I believe passionately that we need to get back to those basics, that relationship foundation built on respect for difference and understanding increasingly, and unfortunately the Good Friday Agreement doesn't adequately provide for this, that unionism and nationalism isn't the sum total of political identity now, and that those aren't identities fixed at birth, and they aren't mutually exclusive as well. I think people can be changing in those. If we're to make any progress in restoring trust, we have to start to vision more than just separate but equal in the North, and start to re-establish those conversations. I still do think, as many people do, like it or not, we think within the strands of Hume's relationship, and there's an irony that now in the Good Friday Agreement language, the whole of Europe is talking about the Good Friday Agreement, but you come to Belfast and it's not working, and people who oppose the Good Friday Agreement or who used it for the bits that suit them are still using that language. And I think whatever period that we're going through, nobody has come up with a better idea than those basic premises of partnership and compromise. The biggest challenge, though, in Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement could have been the toolkit that saw us through it. Unfortunately, we did politically walk off the job, and I think it's hard to see how the Assembly could still be functioning as Brexit has unravelled as it did. But it was about that eye contact theory and that irresistible force of compromise. And if you look at the committee system, even in Westminster, even where they have strong Brexiters on committees, if you have to stare at evidence for hours and hours in the day in a committee hearing, eventually, there's very little wriggle room on some of those immutable facts. And I think the space for compromise that we could have found in a boring Assembly committee that we're certainly not going to find on a debate show at 9 o'clock on BBC, and that's that potential to find consensus was was taken away. So Hume's three-stranded approach, which of course was about the relationships within Northern Ireland, the North-South relationships and the East-West relationships, and I've always felt that there was a sort of an unwritten strand 4 of the European dimension, and of course it's baked into the Good Friday Agreement, but there wasn't an explicit EU strand, and actually people like Mark Durkan, who were involved in that negotiation, will tell us that was because at the time the Unionist parties and Sinn Féin were both fairly Eurosceptic, so to spare their blushes, I suppose, and to avoid making the Good Friday Agreement more difficult for them to buy, it wasn't put into the Good Friday Agreement. And I know there's been legal testing of the extent to which the Good Friday Agreement is undermined by Brexit, and I think the core tragedy of all of it, even if you strip out the trade issues and the degradation of rights and loss of environmental protections and so on, the core tragedy of Brexit for Northern Ireland is that the Good Friday Agreement was about not having to talk about identity and the Constitution and borders and whether you look to London or whether you look to Dublin, and now that's all we talk about, literally morning, noon and night in our media, and no other issues to temper it. So it remains to be seen, that sort of four-strand approach and that sort of imagination of the Good Friday Agreement. We're running out of time for that to be applied, and I'm still very hopeful of either a super soft Brexit or no Brexit at all. But if we do find ourselves in the backstop, it potentially has that ambiguity that the Good Friday Agreement has, that we're both British and Irish in Northern Ireland, and we might potentially be both in and out of the European Union, a version of Schrodinger's Brexit, somebody said. But the East-West relationship is obviously fundamentally altered by Brexit as well, and quite apart from the political needs of Britain and Ireland cooperating on their own in their own economic interests for ideas and for political processes to take hold in Northern Ireland, London and Dublin needed to be cooperating as friends, and indeed in Europe they were able to cooperate as equals. And I think until we're back to that period, it is going to be very difficult to have a process that both communities feel they can buy into. And there is the unfortunate factor that one of the guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, the British government, and the relationship that they currently have, the political expediency that they have to consider in terms of their relationship with the DUP and their reliance on the DUP, is again a factor that's testing the Good Friday Agreement in very extreme ways. And I think even the most disinterested or half-hearted observer can see that strain on the Anglo-Irish relationship, and it's worth saying at this point, while this is a government that has practically no institutional memory of the peace process, and while Labour has traditionally been a very a good and an attractive option for Northern Ireland and for Ireland, it's a matter of great regret to me that they've effectively been asleep at the wheel, with a few honourable exceptions during the Brexit process as well. I think that relationship that the DUP and the UK government have is undermining one of, again, Hume always told us that you've got to keep the process moving. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does Northern Ireland. And I think not having any form of talks or structure is allowing a lot of the negativity to breed. So on the far side of Brexit, whatever Brexit looks like, we have to, as well as the internal relationships, really beef up and re-establish that Anglo-Irish dimension again. Again, I would say that the Good Friday Agreement is a good toolkit to manage that relationship that won't be done to the same extent around the EU infrastructure, but the British-Irish relationships and the Intergovernmental Conference as a vehicle for developing that relationship and managing some of the Northern Irish issues. On the subject of sort of strand 2, the North, South and Irish unity, it's just a fact that the sands are shifting on that, and that people are thinking about it in different ways. And I don't say that to make a political point or because I'm a nationalist and I would think that, but it's important that we're aware of that dynamic, so that we can really look at the relationships that are going to underpin it. And I think even people, and I probably represent a very moderate nationalist tradition in probably the constituency that looks at this least acutely. We're safe distance from the border, and it's a very shared and mixed constituency. But a lot of people are saying that if Brexit is taking us down to ground zero in constitutional terms, then absolutely we're going to re-establish those relationships on a north-south basis, on a lot more of an evolutionary basis. And I think the lack of any political locus in Northern Ireland, but the lack of comfort or leadership from London, has had a lot of people who weren't used to looking to Dublin for their politics doing so and liking what they find. And I think people like me who saw and still do see our political task as making Northern Ireland work and re-establishing stability and building the economy and focusing on reconciliation and not creating turbulence, that argument has less weight in a period of turbulence that you do. But to put the hard foot down for reunification as a consequence for Brexit is just risking repeating very profound mistakes, and there's a potential that it would just be a reversal of what we had before. And I think making unity, as I say, a consequence of a chaotic Brexit is exactly as vacuous as Brexit. And I think no modern pluralist state is going to be built on slipping a wee majority past in a border poll while Britain is essentially on fire and Northern Ireland is dealing with that. Even the phrase and the rhetoric around we want unionists to be part of the conversation does feel a little bit empty as well, particularly from a lot of the places that it's coming from people that did, through their actions in the past or sneaking regarding for the actions in the past, have I think taken out their credibility in that process. And again, I go back to Hume. Irish unity is about uniting people and not territory, and Brexit has done not one thing to unite people. There's a lot of talk at the moment about the New Ireland Forum, and I've said it myself, well, we've just re-established the New Ireland Forum, and somebody put it to me, would you, as you consider a confident nationalist, if asked, would I join a forum to reimagine the Union in the 21st century? And we have to be alive to that even offering it as we want you to be part of the conversation outside of the Good Friday Agreement functioning, it's hard to see how even the most confident unionists could view that without suspicion and scepticism. So I think only by getting the institutions up and running can we have the platforms and the structures on which we can have this conversation that needs to be had in a constructive and a non-threatening way. And something as well, nationalism hasn't picked up, that we're using push factors like Brexit and not the pull factor of what is a modern dynamic country now. And I think nationalism, Irish nationalism in Northern Ireland, needs to think of itself not as righting an historical wrong, because too much we take our nationalism from people who wanted Protestants to go back to England and wanted women to stay at home, and it's not something that's going to sell that modern state. So rather than wallowing in historical injustice, we can articulate a positive, progressive idea for what Ireland could look like, north and south, and we haven't done that. And we spoke earlier, Mary and I, about the conversation and the process that needs to be had here in the south, because there's an assumption that a referendum here would just all fall into place without any groundwork being done. So I just come back to the New Ireland Forum, which seemed like the silver bullet, somewhere to have the relationship, and I think it'll have to be supplemented by structures like a citizens' assembly and other more imaginative ways to look at social change that have been really successful here. But there's no point in doing those things until we've re-established the institutions in the north, because we can't expect unionists and even the most basic command of an abacus will tell you that you need to persuade people towards support for anything sustainable, and that can't be done outside those institutions. So in the final strand, I suppose, strand 1 in the north, which is probably where things are most turbulent at the moment. And it is important, I believe, and I don't think this is being done enough. Those of us who believe in the new Ireland need to be very clear that we haven't checked out of strand 1, because I think that's the perception now, that people are saying we're post the Good Friday Agreement and we're just into accelerating unity, and that's certainly not a constructive place to be. And I think the deliberate insertion of identity issues, Brexit was a good foundation for doing that. It's the ultimate identity issue, but we know from Northern Ireland, if you put things like Brexit or things like Irish language and things, if you make them the centre and the only item in political discussion, the people who agree with it will run in one direction and the people who don't will run in the other direction. And it feels like there are big barriers to clamber over before we can get on with discussing any issues. And I think you can sum up the last 2 years of stalemate in Northern Ireland as, we'd love to help you with that education or health issue, but we can't because of them, because the blame has been very neatly cleaved as well, just depending on your constitutional preference. And that's, again, part of the caricaturing that nationalism and unionism are doing with one another. But while everybody is united in their frustration that we don't have the institutions, you will find in the main people of a nationalist background blaming the DUP and people of a unionist background blaming Sinn Féin. And our system, unfortunately, and I think while it's a conversation for another day, the Good Friday Agreement does lock that sectarianism into the system. And if you are frustrated with them, and the quickest way to deal with it, people will see, is to vote for Ussens, and it's getting absolutely nowhere, and it's sucking all of the energy out of the room. One of the positive things in my mind that was growing kind of fairly organically up until Brexit was the concept of Northern Irishness. And for many of us, it's a subset of your Irishness, or it's a subset of your Britishness. And there was a rejection of it from a lot of quarters, that it wasn't sufficiently Irish enough, it wasn't sufficiently British enough, it was partitioned enough. And I used to always say in reply to that, have you ever met anybody from Cork? It's perfectly rational to have a regional identity and a pride in your common identity that doesn't in any way make you have less of a nationalist identity. And that's something, that was one of the factors, again, that isn't really accommodated in the Good Friday Agreement. There isn't a role in governance for the increasing numbers of people who may say, yes, I do believe in the Union, or I do believe in United Ireland, but it's not how I want to be defined. And before Brexit, we haven't had a kind of a census type polling of people, but that was coming to about a quarter of the population who were defining as Northern Irish. And as I say, even if you had an upper layer to your identity as well, I think that's something overwhelmingly positive. And I think the fact that it was viewed with such suspicion by the parties on the polls encouraged me to believe it was a positive factor. But it is one of the potential victims of Brexit and the attempt, as I say, to make it sectarian, because those are the tools we know how to use. We know that within 2 hours of the referendum result in 2016, on Sinn Féin side, it had been made about a border poll, and on the DUP side, a lot of rhetoric about not using the borders of the past, but taking literally every single opportunity available to them in Westminster to vote for a harder type of Brexit. And I suppose the irony is that if the DUP had used their numerical advantage in Westminster, they could have brought in a soft Brexit, or even the backstop, which, to be honest, would lock in devolution and the role for Northern Ireland if we have the best of both worlds, albeit both worlds would have been greatly diminished. And I think whatever comes out of this period, historians will scratch their head and potentially laugh at how the DUP handled this opportunity. But it is fair to say I don't get the sense from either of the two larger parties that they view Brexit in much more than how it affects their own electoral prospects. And I think the likes of the votes that will come through today and in the last few weeks, either or both of those parties, if they had chosen to put kind of the national interest over their own party political interest, could have been the margin of victory for whichever for whichever way. But that power without responsibility is part of the political DNA of the North, and one of the issues we need to address. But for all of that change, I think selling the border poll as the simple answer is, as I say, a mirror image of Brexit. And it's easy to see how that happens. Brexit, it wasn't just, do you not like the EU, do you not like Lithuanians, do you not like the smoking ban or feminism or globalization. Brexit was the answer to all of those things, and there's a danger that it's not just if you don't like, Brexit, if you don't like orange marches and elites and so on, that the border poll is the answer. So it's managing that and potentially looking at what mechanisms we can use to judge when the appropriate time is to put that question, rather than putting it into the electoral cycle for forever and a day. And I think, I suppose, my big lesson from all of it, and I might want to get a tattoo of this, that there's no constitutional arrangement that makes all of your problems go away. And I think that's what has been lost. We just outside, I see the Martin Turner exhibition, and a cartoon of a man being vox popped under the street. Under which constitutional arrangement would you prefer to be unemployed? And we haven't, 2 decades on, really moved a lot further than that kind of fairly narrow understanding of constitution and the nation state. So to manage this turbulence, it's going to be part of the furniture. I don't see, whatever way Brexit is resolved, the genie's not going back into the bottle anytime soon. And I think some of those political tone and the type of politics isn't going away, and that toxification in politics isn't going away. And certainly in the North, a substantial number of people will have a deep attachment to their preference for Brexit, not Brexit, Irish unity, UK, and won't be parted from that, regardless of how it impacts their neighbours. And that's their right to do that. But given that we are, the ox and the goats for many more years, we have to manage that. We have to widen participation in the democratic process. Again, is an issue I feel very strongly about, and it's probably, it is largely the same here. Far less than 1% of the population are involved in the boring business of democracy, of engaging people on policy, of knocking doors, and of trying to get people to participate in that representative democracy. And as I say, we have no alternative, imperfect as it is. Long may that be how power changes hands. So we have to try and find ways to engage more people in that, against the tide of that sort of two-dimensional media and 24-hour news cycles that thrive on that polarisation. Those of us who, in fact, whatever your constitutional preference, but those of us who do believe in the new Ireland, need to not buy into the post-Brexit myth that the place is ungovernable because somebody is governing Northern Ireland. It's just not being done in a way that's accountable to the electorate, and in a way that is broadly consistent with principles of power sharing. Just to conclude, I want to come back to that core theme on the importance of relationships, and it's clear that Brexit was the straw that broke the camel's back, but they had been neglected and eroded. And I Google searched the audio for this, but what I was talking about is it. Your man who pushed the boulder up the hill. Anyway, I did a play last month as part of a festival. They got politicians to do Heaney's The Cure at Troy, which was literally all Greek to me, but we all had all our Greek words written down in our scripts. I thought I'd got this one down, but it is about that. That's the one. Yeah, I was quite confident on the train that I had the pronunciation, but I don't even want to try it now. But and it is we were how he managed to do that, and you do sometimes feel in electoral politics you are pushing that boulder up and down the hill, and I think Camus said that it was each time he got to the top of the hill, he would see the big wide world and the rising sun and manage to find hope. So we do have to continue doing that. And for Northern Ireland, we have to stop looking just at the past for our justification and just at the future for our justification for not doing anything, and focus increasingly on the here and now, and make politics about allowing people to talk to one another and not at each other. And final quote, because I bounced around and missed a few bits there, we might fix them up in questions, but as Seamus Maldon, in the first year of devolution, the people in Northern Ireland belong together, the we's and the they's will sink or swim together, and that's as true as it was before Brexit.
Thanks very much, Claire. That was great. I don't know what fresh horrors have materialised in Westminster.
I know.
It's great to get sort of a calm reflection in a way about what's been happening. And I think that the point you make about identity being the prism through which Northern Ireland in particular sees Brexit, it's very important for us to understand that, I suppose. And maybe we don't understand it sufficiently. So thanks very much. It was really wonderful. I know Claire's happy to take questions from the audience.
Yeah, Claire, in a personal capacity, how did you get on with Mike Nesbitt, the UUP leader? Was he amiable?
Yes, very amiable.
Because I actually met him in Dublin during the IRA during the I was
going to say, start a rumour.
It was the first time the union was part. They came over for the commemoration, and I actually met him up there, and it was enlightening. I found him very progressive too.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, and I don't think I get on very well with Mike, and I don't think he'd mind me saying this. There's something about political unionism, the liberation of not being the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party allowed his kind of political sensibilities to come out, because I think just at the tail end of his time as Ulster Unionist Party leader, he actually, and it's easy to forget if you weren't watching it very closely, there was a 10-month period where we and the Ulster Unionists and the other smaller parties were in an opposition together, and it was really beginning to work, and it was really beginning to bind together. And I think in many ways that's why the executive was collapsed, because there was a lot of heat coming from it. But Mike was very brave to say, to transfer directly kind of across communities, and I must say that's something that I've always done, and it's just the political culture I grew up in, that you did transfer immediately to the Ulster Unionist Party as a kind of a demonstration of those values. But I think it was something a lot of people responded to, and it's easy to forget in the terrible macro elections that both the SDLP and the UUP had, that cross-community transfer, and I know it feels very remedial to say that, saved 2 Ulster Unionist seats and 3 SDLP seats. So without it, we would have been, with that sectarian juggernaut that ran through 2 years ago, we would have been in a lot worse of a position. Mike is really interesting in that he is doing what he calls thinking the unthinkable a lot. We were both down last month at the Doyle 100 thing, so I remember taking a selfie going down here with this Lundy, because he is, I mean, and he's open to all of those conversations. He's somebody that again knows that potentially in his lifetime, certainly in the lifetime of his children, that we may have constitutional change in that way, and that the sensible thing to do is to get involved with it. But I don't criticise others that aren't rushing to get involved with it. As I say, when it was asked back to me, would I be rushing to get involved with it if the shoe was on the other foot? But yeah, no, a nice guy, liberated from not having to lead a party that probably wasn't ready to go with him where he was going on that.
Just to say thanks very much, Claire, for a really enjoyable talk. Your persona, certainly your public persona in politics, has always been presented as your nationalism having a very healthy dash of red in the green. You touched on their continuing problem we've had for some time, post Good Friday Agreement, about the centre not holding.
Yeah.
In Northern Ireland, nobody knows that better than
the
SDLP. And so, with that in mind, and trying to consider ways out of breaking out of that sort of balkanisation of politics or whatever. I mean, notwithstanding the mistrust that the unionist community would have for Corbyn MacDonald Labour Party, I'm wondering about your thoughts about the history of or non-history of the British Labour Party standing in Northern Ireland, and the SDLP stance on that.
Yeah, and it's a complicated one, because I mean, I remember sort of about 15 years ago when I was sort of independently becoming politically involved, and I participated in what were then the Labour forums, which was SDLP and Irish Labour and British Labour, and we didn't get it together then because we floundered on the constitutional question and it's easy to say as I kind of did at the time, and I know the British Labour Party members, and I'm only calling them British Labour Party to differentiate between the two, I'm not marking them out by their identity, said, well, you would either be pro status quo or you wouldn't take a position on the constitutional issue. And it's easy to not take a position on the constitutional issue and say it's for another day. I believe it's for another day, but it doesn't get you over all the hurdles of other cultural issues and legacy issues that bring the same issues up every day. So for the British Labour Party, and I say this to any time I'm engaging with them, anybody who has the answers, by God, bring them forward. Put yourself before the electorate if you know how to get us out of this mess. So I've always been a free marketeer when it comes to elections. If anybody can put a candidate on the ground and that organisation, that they should put it forward. I think you'll be aware that the SDLP is now in a relationship with Fianna Fáil, and you'll probably be aware that's not something I've supported. It means that something will emerge now on the centre left, like it or like it not, because there's a core, probably a few dozen activists, but a couple of thousand members of the British Labour Party who have been seeking to run for a long time. And I think the relationship and the SDLP, and we operate the Party of European Socialist franchise, and that has been a kind of a convenient answer as well for the UK Labour Party. And with that, if that changes, then there will be. I don't see anybody, even Corbyn, McDonnell, I don't see them busting to have people running in Northern Ireland, because, as I say, it's complex and there's reputational damage, and there is that principle that both governments should be impartial here. You know, they shouldn't have skin in the game electorally, and I think that's a good principle. It's impossible. I don't think I don't think there should be any scenario where there isn't a centre-left grouping in Northern Ireland. So something will emerge, but it's just a turbulent time. It's a political washing machine, so it's hard to know.
What about the prospect of somebody like yourself heading of a return to the Northern Ireland Labour Party?
Well, you see, this is the thing. It will have to be if something, and my head's cut with Brexit and constituency stuff. Leave me alone. But it's whatever, and something. That's what I'm saying. I don't know what will emerge, but if the SDLP completely vacate the PES space, something will emerge, and it's to me, it's something that should have a similar character to the SDLP, but obviously root itself currently in centre-left politics. But it's very hard not to be buttressed. The SDLP's electoral base is nationalist and entitled to be so. I know my own constituency, my own voter base, I'd say, is probably about 2/3 nationalist, and there's a growing non-nationalist, and there's that sense, I'm misquoting the West Wing, you've got to dance with the one that brung you, you've got to kind of, that will always define your politics. So something will emerge. I don't know exactly what it will be, but I think it will be very, very important to keep that in a non-sectarian space, and to define it clearly enough that it doesn't flounder on the rocks of an Irish Language Act or the first prosecutions of soldiers or whatever, something that can keep that character. I have my own views about where that would sit on constitutional issues, but it brings us on to the designation issue, and quite simply, we need to move to a post-designation place, and I say that as somebody who's wholly committed to the principle of power sharing, and that's a personal view. That's definitely not an SDLP view, but it is locking it in, and we're not. It's that kind of paradigm shift that comes every 2 decades or so in Northern Ireland. Maybe the Good Friday Agreement structures, you can still move on with D'Hunt and processes like that, but designation and indeed the mandatory coalition that gives you no incentive to compromise are locking in the problem at the moment. Yeah. Fudge answer.
We live in hope.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed your remarks. I'm just thinking, we had Steve Aiken here a few months back as well. When you actually look at Brexit and the configuration of politics across the north, I mean, the DUP has hijacked the unionist position.
Yeah.
Sinn Féin has contributed precisely nothing to these debates, either north or south, through abstentionism and by its policies down here, which I think are disgraceful. And yet, not just on the left of centre like yourself, but across northern opinion. I mean, I'm thinking of industry, I'm thinking of agriculture in particular, and I'm thinking of the vote as it actually was taken in 2016. There must be a substantial number of people who are profoundly unhappy with what has been happening. Why are their voices not more audible? Is it just the primordial quality of tribal politics.
That's pretty much what it is. And then the loss, as I say, of the assembly and that kind of daily platform and literally microphone hanging down from the ceiling that allows you the place to say that. And of course the Westminster result, and Westminster has always been fundamentally unsuitable because it's a two-horse race, and we now the notable exception is Sylvia Herman. I don't know if you're following her work, which has been brilliant on that, but in trying to counteract the DUP. So there is absolutely an industry, you're right, really found its voice in a way that they'd never done through the Troubles and all the parts of processes in articulating that kind of sensible Brexit voice and really standing up to the DUP and Sinn Féin. So there is a voice, but it's shredded. And bear in mind, we haven't kind of had an opportunity to electorally voice it in the last 2 years. But if you look at a constituency like mine, in which 70% of people voted to remain, we're represented by a DUP extreme Brexiter because there is so much voice, but it's shredded across 4 or 5 pro-Remain parties. So it is people, and I don't think people will be quite so casual about that the last time, because nobody thought that Northern Irish MPs would ever be so pivotal in the process. I mean, it wasn't on a bus as such, but it was one of the it was brushed aside because it had never been the case, and it's kind of a statistical freak. But yeah, I think that is frustrating. The voice is fragmenting, and I suppose it's a bit like what's happening in Westminster. There's 50 shades of Brexit opinion, basically, that you can, but that is something that, whether it's for Brexit or for, future configuration and re-establishing, the centre ground has to get a lot more coherent. If you look at the last Assembly election, where in fact the DUP's veto was taken off them by the electorate, and it is an aside, but if we had gone into an assembly, then we would have equal marriage, we would have an Irish Language Act, we would have all of those things that there is a majority for, and particularly that consensus around the petition of concern as well. So those things would have gone through. But if you look, there is a DUP 29 when you include the TUV, same in Sinn Féin, but there is a middle block there, and I think we weren't coherent enough about the alternative. And I think with respect to the SDLP and the UUP, we were kind of pale imitations. We kind of put our toe in and out of there of providing an alternative, but in a lot of ways we hugged quite closely to our big brother of the DUP or Sinn Féin, and we didn't show people that there was a completely different way. So I think a lot of times people thought, well, if I have to have, some version of this, I might as well take the real tough guys, because, heaven forbid we'd elect our moderate nationalists in the SDLP and them and elect their DUP and vice versa. So we in the centre have to find ways to be a lot more coherent, and we're working on that.
One of the comments I heard was, the Brexit is a tragedy, great loss. One of the other losses I thought I heard was that for this, people had met in the European Parliament.
Yeah.
Allow people to actually meet and talk.
Yeah.
If when Brexit happens, that all goes away, that opportunity is gone.
Yeah.
Factor there.
Yeah, it is, and it's fun. Again, Hume, and of course, as I say, Hume was Europhile to his core. It's a key part of who he was in the SDLP's politics. But and he always said, yeah, it'll be a forum for kind of cooperation. I don't know that opportunity was ever really taken. And while there was a wee bit of, like, if people would have gone over to Westminster as a student or from industry or whatever, or to the European Parliament, you would have met each of the MEPs. But I don't have any sense that over the last 10 or 15 years they were really cooperating in any meaningful way. I can't think of any initiatives that those 3 Northern Irish MEPs. It's also kind of ignorant, to be honest, that Northern Ireland, such a beneficiary in terms of the European money for a start in terms of the structural and peace funds, but also just that, I mean, if you read the Treaty of Rome and you read the preamble of the Good Friday Agreement, they're the same document, really. It's the same. We borrowed so much, but we sent back 3 Eurosceptic MPs, which I think was quite ignorant of us to do so for the last couple of elections. So that practical loss, I think the loss of MEPs, yes, it will be a loss, but it's probably, I'm not minimising it, but it's not the top one. And I don't believe that the 3 parties that have held those seats since whatever it was, 2007 maybe, 2009, when Hume left, was it his? before that. But anyway, I don't get any sense that they were utilising there's no spotlight on us. We can actually kind of work together a little bit here. I don't get the sense that happened.
Do you have any thoughts on Mark Duckin, the fact that he's standing for election in Dublin?
Do you know what? I think fair play to Mark. He is somebody it's so valuable in terms of his memory and just, the writing of the Good Friday Agreement and the knowledge of all the different processes. So I can completely understand him wanting to put that back in politics. And in a way, an MEP is probably, you get to be, it's the most ideologically pure way to be a practicing politician. It is all the big tickets. So I can understand that. I would. And I must say, I wouldn't be a Fine Gael supporter myself, but I think the Ireland that they're building is quite attractive, and they've played a blinder on the Brexit front in a lot of ways. So I can understand them doing that. And I suppose what I would say is, at the time when the SDLP entered its relationship with Fianna Fáil, I and some others proposed an amendment that would have allowed that process to absolutely go on, but it wouldn't have been exclusive. So then the Mark thing wouldn't have been such a disaster, if you know what I mean. The SDLP has always been a broad church. It's always been people who would have affiliation with Labour, with Fine Gael, with Fianna Fáil, and no affiliation at all. And while that was a bit unnatural and it probably was going to unravel at some point, I don't think this was the point to unravel it. I hope he gets it. By the end of the day, we could be running MEP elections ourselves in Northern Ireland. It's one of those things. I hope we do, if it means we're staying in the EU. But please God, no, not another election. But fair play to him. And I think he'd be really valuable. And there is a democratic deficit. If we are an actual democratic deficit as opposed to the imaginary democratic deficit that the Brexiters have pushed. But if we are, still taking EU regulations and
but his calibre would be a great loss to politics tomorrow morning.
It was a great loss, exactly. And I suppose it would be very hard personally to take that. And there's no other way. I mean, you can, do punditry and you can be on a board and you can give advice, but there's nothing like being there's no replacement. And actually, if you look, somebody of Mark's calibre here or across the water who left kind of day-to-day practicing politics would have been probably snapped up into some sort of a role, but there wasn't an appropriate one that could really capture and utilise Mark's range of experience over decades, because bear in mind he was kind of Hume's right-hand man even before he was in the front line himself.
In short form, Claire, why was the decision taken to collapse the executive? By whom and why?
Okay, that's in short form. How long have you got? We've got 3. So it's fair to say that there was a groaning pile of 2 difficult issues: legacy and all of the stuff around identity, flags and lampposts, marching, all that stuff. We kept going, it's really hard, and putting it to the side. And there was a lot of decisions, day-to-day decisions about, budgets, whether transfer to primary school, after primary schools, health sector reform, all that kind of stuff, that it was a black hole. We didn't make a lot of decisions. So that was straining. Then there were the corruption issues, and particularly the DUP around renewable heat incentive. You'll be aware of cash for ash and just the scandal of that. And I'm not a defender of Sinn Féin in any way, shape or form, Sinn Féin knew about that, and I do think they took some steps to try and deal with it. They weren't, they weren't filling their boots to the same extent, and I see that they did try and address it. But there were other, NAMA as well had a big manifestation in the north, and probably, I don't know if it did make the news here, the Social Investment Fund, which was essentially a kind of a slush fund that the Office of First and Deputy First Minister, an £80 million fund that was kind of the way to get cash to your preferred community groups. And that's something you really do have to worry about here, not letting that culture, that carve-up culture, come into politics. But it took things like neighbourhood renewal out of the social development. It took kind of adult education things out of, it took the kind of interesting bits out of portfolios that the Ulster Unionist or the Alliance or the SDLP held and put it into the centre, and it allowed people to get a tap on the shoulder and there's a few quid for you rather than going through public procurement. So all of those issues, and then Brexit, really just, they were pulling in just very, very different directions.
Was it a deliberate decision?
Yes, it was. It was. I think it was a deliberate decision, and I remember in the election that preceded it, we kind of knew it wasn't coming back. It wasn't just a case, and the rhetoric wasn't, well, look, we'll have an election and see what that throws out, and then we'll all get back around the table. I think there were factors around the fact that I don't think Sinn Féin wanted to have to transition from Martin McGuinness to Michelle O'Neill. That was going to be difficult for them. It is worth saying that the day before that Westminster election was called in April, the April the 4th, 2017. I know because I had a 4-day-old baby at the time when the election was called. I remember just thinking, no, this is. But the there was a deal kind of on the table there, and as I say, the DUP UK government relationship really muddied the waters there. So yes, it was a deliberate attempt to take it down, there's no doubt about that, and we said at the time, taking it down is the easy part, but re-establishing it is very, very difficult, and we know that from previous suspensions. So I completely understand that it was really, really difficult, but as I say, not one of those issues, not one of the kind of ostensible issues around marriage equality and around language, not one of them is getting better in the vacuum, and it has created a hierarchy of rights in that we're talking about those issues, and we're not talking about your right to, your right to government, your right to meaningful health sector reform. A bill I was doing on breastfeeding in public places that was about to become law. That's a right that has been lost. So we have created a hierarchy with it. But yes, it was definitely done deliberately and with no strategy for re-establishment. I don't think anybody predicted how much we'd spin to the polls and how much every issue would drag out in that way. So that's why it was reckless to do it without a plan of how you get back.
Claire, final question. With the lack of leadership in the north at the moment, is it now inevitable that direct rule is going to be reintroduced? No,
it's not inevitable because it's not well. It's hard to see the assembly back in. Best case scenario, Brexit magically goes away or whatever, or is soft, and we get back into talks in the autumn, but there's a lot to still deal with. So no, I feel we're going to be in this zombie position for a while yet, because the UK government don't really want direct rule either. Again, they know that when you finally set it adrift, it's hard to pull it back in, and the fact that they've muddled along for 2 years without it, they'll muddle for another year. But the problem is, it's just a point in time loss. Nobody will, we don't, it's cut and paste and cut and paste and cut and paste with absolutely no innovation in public services. But no, I think they threatened it in the last day or two that if there's a no deal Brexit, and I think that was an attempt to sort of cajole the DUP, but I don't get the sense that they want this on their plate either. So I think we're going to zombie along for another year or so.
Finish on a zombie note.
Always finish on a zombie note.
Can I just say, Claire, the fact that there is no assembly, I think is all the more regrettable having listened to you today, because your voice and the voice of those like you is lost without that institution. So for that reason alone, let's hope things improve. Yeah. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And for talking to us and for the fascinating insights and your reflections on what's happened. We're very grateful.
Thank you. Cheers.